few months and few years on really boosting their, arts and culture programs. And there's really a lot to offer. I'm supposed to say this, so they do have music classes, language courses, and all sorts of things that could be of interest to you. You can follow them online at the at Yunus at the link that will be available again behind me. So the Institute really welcomes you all today, and the speaker we have today, Diana Darke. Myself, I've been really, really enthusiastic on seeing her in person and hearing about the great works that she's put forward. Myself, I'm from an architecture background, and this is a field of research interest to me as well. So the ideas that Diana has put forward are very interesting, and I believe it's the first time that somebody may have had a book that is so radical in its way. So we really is something I'm very looking forward to, and thank you to Mehmet and all the other Yunus Emre staff for making this possible. So thank you guys again, and we'll start with Diana. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. I'm going to be slightly torn between having to be glued to this and if I want to turn to look at the screen the whole time. So I may have to fiddle a bit with this. But yes, as Samie mentioned, it's an ambitious book, and it's the subject that hasn't been attempted before, although many scholars have studied, in fact, devoted decades of their lives to studying one particular aspect of these things that I'm covering in the book. But what's been lacking is somebody who's come along and joined the dots of this huge jigsaw and put it all into an accessible form, if you like. Let me explain, first of all, because it's been controversial, the title, because the title was very carefully chosen. The word Saracens had to be in the title because of Christopher Wren. Christopher Wren, as I'm sure you know, the architect of St. Paul's, the greatest English architect. And there's the dome of St. Paul's, obviously, on the right. And he wrote at the end of his life, and he lived to be 90, so he had a very long life, exposed to many, many different influences. And in his memoirs at the end of his life, he wrote that what we call the Gothic style should rightly be called the Saracen style. And he explains that when he built St. Paul's Cathedral, and he said architecture should aim for eternity, he said, I used Saracen vaulting because it was the best. And he explains then through diagrams why it was the best. And he was completely open about it, and said that this Gothic, so-called Gothic style was a complete misnomer. And so my book, therefore, the title, stealing from the Saracens, because Saracens, the derivation of the word, is from the Arabic salaka, to steal, so sariqin, people who steal. So in other words, it's like a double irony. We are taking things from people we call thieves. So it's a very deliberate double irony. It's meant to be slightly funny because the whole situation is actually absurd on one level. And the cover of the book is the inside vault of St. Paul's Cathedral. So that's all been very carefully chosen. Now, the thing that triggered me writing the book at all, because to be honest, I assumed that most people knew the backstory of Gothic, but it was clear from the reaction of the world when Notre Dame caught fire in April 2019, from this great outpouring of world reaction about the French saying our national identity is going up in flames. And I looked at this and I thought, wait a minute, don't people realise that pretty much every feature of Gothic architecture, apart from the flying buttresses, has in fact nothing to do with France, but has been brought into France from much further east, and a lot of it can be proved to be of Islamic origin. And the pointed arches, the trefoil arches, all of these things, as I will explain as I go through. And so I then decided to write a book to explain about this, since the knowledge appeared to have been forgotten, along with Christopher Wren's remark. And what I uncovered was an extraordinary series of things. The statue on the right is the decapitated head of Denis, the patron saint of France. And this statue is on the front of Notre Dame Cathedral. And what I discovered, and this turned out to be quite common, was what I call a medieval muddle. A lot of confused identities, where the clergy, if you like, I mean, there was no internet in those days, but fake information was alive and well. You know, that the clergy could say pretty much anything, and everybody else, largely illiterate population, just believed it. And so it was a genuine muddle that the person who's Denis, now the patron saint of France, in fact got confused with somebody who was claiming to be the apostle, the disciple of the apostle Paul, but who was actually, in later scholarship, was shown to be a Syrian monk. So this is all explained in the book, and by the way, the book is fully footnoted and illustrated, so all the source material is given, and very often the source material is actually the archive material of Christian monasteries and churches, because the abbots very often asked the monks to keep records of building projects, and so a lot of the proof, if you like, is actually in the church's own archives. So Syrian Denis, as I call him from this point on, takes us to Syria. And those of you who know Syria may immediately recognize this as one of the so-called dead cities in Idlib province in northwest Syria, where there are literally hundreds of early Christian villages, early Byzantine villages from the 4th, 5th, and 6th century. And this is a real treasure trove of early Christian architecture. And one of the most iconic churches there, the most famous one, is the Basilica of St. Simeon, St. Simeon Stylites. On the right there is the remains of his pillar. Stylite means a pillar, and so he preached from the top of his pillar. And this basilica was the pilgrimage site of its day. It was the Santiago de Compostela of its day. People traveled from Europe to visit it. It was in existence 50 years before Hagia Sophia in Istanbul. And the quality of the stonemasonry there, of the natural limestone in the hills, it shows you the way. You can even see the movement in the acanthus leaves on the top of the capitals there. And this skill of Syrian stonemasonry is literally as old as the hills. And this early skill was observed by European pilgrims making the pilgrimage to St. Simeon's. And so the knowledge of all these skills was then carried back. And in St. Simeon, in France to this day, there are 2 villages called St. Simeon, and I visited them now. And this one on the right is a stained glass window in the church of St. Simeon. It's about an hour's drive east of Paris. There he is on his pillar. So again, he became a very, very well-known European saint. The picture on the right is St. Simeon again on his pillar inside the Basilica of St. Mark's in Venice. So this, if you like, is the sort of Christian foundations of early Christian architecture. And the earliest example of the Twin Towers flanking a monumental entrance occurs amongst those dead cities, a famous church called Kalblauze, which is still standing in the province of Idlib, which is, of course, under Syrian opposition control now. The Assad regime does not control Idlib province, and yet remarkably that many of these churches are still standing. So that is, if you like, the foundation, the early inheritance of the first Muslim dynasty then inherited the Umayyads. When the Umayyads came into Syria and established their capital in Damascus, the Caliph Abdul Malik, the first Umayyad structure to be built was the Dome of the Rock in Jerusalem. And some people might look at that and say, well, it's just a Byzantine building, isn't it? But it's not at all. Yes, it has elements of Byzantine architecture about it. The octagonal shape was inherited, and the domed shape was inherited. But there are major innovations here that the Umayyads brought in. Apart from the fact that, of course, the decoration is on the outside, and that is completely unique. In Byzantine structures, all the mosaic work is on the inside, the outside is always very plain. But not only that, inside the Dome of the Rock, for the first time, you see the beginnings of the pointed arch in the arcade in the center, and also the beginnings of the trefoil arch. So you see the beginnings there of the pointed arch in the arcade, and then the trefoil arch under the dome, a little row of trefoil arches. These are key elements which then find their way back to Europe because, of course, in the Crusades, when the Templars took over Jerusalem after the First Crusade, they, again, another case of a medieval model, they mistook the Dome of the Rock for the Temple of Solomon and marked it as such on their maps and on their coins, and appearing to be ignorant of the fact that it was in fact a Muslim shrine, and that the inscription on the outside was an admonishment to Christians for believing in the Trinity rather than believing in one God. So it's an extraordinary example again of information that people did not understand at the time. There was clearly a bit of a gulf between the ruling crusaders and the local population, who actually initially mistook the Muslims for another heretical Christian sect. So the statement of the Dome of the Rock was the first time a building actually announced, no, we are a different religion. And the other Umayyad structure, very, very well known, is the Umayyad Mosque of Damascus. And again, you've only got to look at that to see how blended the architecture is. So you've got the Byzantine style dome up there, you've got sort of Hellenistic gable, like all the Hellenistic sites which are all over, Roman and Hellenistic sites that are all over Syria, like Palmyra and places. And here you've got what looks to a European eye like a sort of a bell tower, a campanile, but it is in fact the Jesus minaret. And local tradition has it that on the final day of judgment, Christ will descend from this minaret. And that is very typical of the blending of Christian and Muslim traditions. And on a Sunday in Damascus to this day, you will hear church bells ringing out and the call to prayer simultaneously. Again, it's this blended culture that is so important to understand, and important to understand that, of course, both the Roman and Byzantine empires were multicultural and multi-ethnic. Early Christians were multicultural and multi-ethnic. So this is something that, the European mentality, if you like, of sort of 19th century has found it difficult to grasp, I think, and has had this tendency to appropriate everything as if it was all European. And this is the interior courtyard of the Umayyad Mosque. The mosaics here, I'm showing you this because one of the very earliest examples of Islamic art, and it is trying to depict visions of paradise with the trees and the rivers and the fantasized gardens and fantasized buildings. But again, you've got this extraordinary blending. So you've got the triple arch, so that's taken from the churches all around Syria, but here it's absorbed into an Islamic building, representing, so in Christian terms it would represent the Trinity, but here it's just been absorbed, and you've got the Hellenistic columns. So again, all absorbed into a new synthesis in the early Islamic art that the Umayyads created, and there again you've got the little trefoil arches. Sorry, it's a bit slow sometimes to move on. So here again, another Umayyad structure, again, twin towers flanking a main monumental entrance. This is from one of the desert palaces of the Umayyads. Very eclectic style again. So again, adopting the early church architecture, but synthesizing it into something new and having rounded towers rather than square ones. And this is in fact the main entrance of the Damascus National Museum. You can still see this today. This is the gardens in front where there are many sculptures as well. And you can still see that. And this is a close-up of an Umayyad palace in Mushatta, which is on display in Berlin in the Islamic Museum there. So you can get really close to this to see again this extraordinary skill of stonemasonry that the Syrians possessed, and the effusive nature of the carving. So again, it's this synthesis of earlier styles, and yet it's completely new, and it has this sense of bursting with nature, a sort of spontaneity of bursting with nature and animals intertwined in the foliage, completely unlike anything that had been seen in Hellenistic structures, but related to it. Okay, it's a bit, yes, it stinks. Yeah. Okay, and then this is the final Umayyad element that has come into Gothic architecture, is the rose window in the Umayyad palace of Khirbat al-Mafjar, which is in the occupied West Bank near Jericho. The excavators found fragments of coloured glass below this reconstructed rose window, and it was in the audience chamber of the palace. And so it is the earliest example of a decorative rose window. And of course, 5 centuries later, it reaches its absolute peak in the stained glass of Chartres Cathedral in Paris, in France. And glass is something, again, which is so extraordinary that Syria was the world leader in glass, essentially, up until 1401, when Tamerlane came in and destroyed Damascus and ran off with many of the craftsmen. From that point on, Venice adopted the techniques that they'd already learned from that they had studied in Damascus, and imported them and kept the monopoly of them in Murano Island. But their recipes still talk about the cinders of Syria as essential ingredients. And scientific analysis of the glass fragments that have been found in some of these early stained glass windows in Umayyad palaces has been matched to the same cobalt blue that exists in the 12th, 13th century cathedrals in Saint-Denis, in Chartres, and even in this country, in Canterbury and York. And so clearly, the Crusaders shipped vast quantities of Syrian glass out to Europe, because at that time Europe did not have the ability to make glass of this quality, with this extraordinary translucent sort of imperfection, sort of organic feel to it that gives the light kind of mystical quality. And so it's the glass, for example, in Notre Dame, the stained glass cathedrals, one of the theories about why glass survived the fire is because the Syrian glass is incredibly strong and flexible, made from this wonderful plant ash that's only found in the salt marshes of Syria. And it has these little bubbles inside that gives it this extra strength. And there's an example in the V&A, if you want to get a close-up view of this exceptional glass. This is what's called the Luck of Edenhall, this goblet, special goblet that is displayed in the V&A. If you get up very close to it, you can see the tiny bubbles inside to give you a sense of the extraordinary craftsmanship of Syrian glass, which was then imported into Europe and again absorbed, and the Venetians took, it became the preeminent manufacturers and kept their monopoly and tried to stop craftsmen ever leaving Murano Island to give their skills anywhere else. So now we move to Spain, because the next key thing, of course, is that the Umayyads come to an end, the Abbasids take over, and one Umayyad prince, Abdurrahman, manages to escape across North Africa, and he founds the Umayyad dynasty in Cordoba, where, so if you like, you now have Syria in Spain, and you can see all the architectural features. He recreates everything that he knew from Umayyad architecture in Cordoba. So you have the same styles. The bell tower going up in stages like this, which is, of course, now these days, it was the minaret, but of course now it's the bell tower because it's become the cathedral under the Reconquista. And here is the dome that's immediately in front of the mihrab in the Cordoba Mesquita. And notice the trefoil arches here along the bottom, which again, are the first time these trefoil arches occurred decoratively on European soil. Now, this is before the Crusades, actually. So before this is 10th century now. So this is the first time that these find their way into European soil. So you have the trefoil arches coming now from Spain, and then later brought in by Crusaders as well. And this vault of this dome here is one of the most superb 10th century vaulting examples. And two Spanish architectural engineers studied it back in 2015, so very recently. It's the first time it had ever been studied. And they established that it was one of the most perfect examples of Saracen vaulting, if you like. I mean, of astonishing geometrical perfection, such that it has not needed structural repair in its entire existence. And this, of course, is well before the vaulted techniques come into Gothic architecture in the naves of cathedrals. And at the back of the Cordoba Mesquita, in one of the early excavations, all the masons' marks were found and then displayed along the back wall, from which you can see from the Arabic script of them that the overwhelming majority of these masons were Arab Muslims. And so this again shows that the skills were imported from Syria. Syrian craftsmen came to Spain, and it was their skills in making these domes and the extraordinary structure of the Cordoba Mesquita that was then, they passed their skills over to Christian masons, and so the skills arrived in Europe. Okay, so these are just more examples inside the Cordoba Mesquita of the arches, trefoil arches on the gateways. I mean, the arch, every kind of arch you could possibly imagine occurs in the Cordoba Mesquita. The horseshoe arch, and then these double arches everywhere inside the Mesquita, which give the appearance of a huge forest. And the use of arches is something that Arab architecture was very fond of. The arch never sleeps, is the proverb. And so every opportunity to use an arch is very much always taken. So here, this is the interlocking arch. We've got an arcade of interlocking arches, and then you see the same thing in Durham Cathedral, a century or two later, interlocking. So in the sort of late Romanesque architecture of Durham Cathedral, again brought back. These are styles that find their way into this country. And this is the Cordoba Mesquita again, where you have multifoil arches now, many which are 5 in the case of this one, with the rather incongruous, imposition of crucifixes inside, the original mosque everywhere around the edges now that it's become a cathedral. And this is the Cordoba Synagogue, where you can see that exactly the same styles were used by the Jews in Cordoba, because they genuinely liked these styles. So it's very difficult to tell them apart. And when the Jews were expelled from Spain in the Reconquista, and most of them were welcomed into the Ottoman Empire, they chose to use the Islamic styles that they had grown used to in Cordoba. And so now with the pointed arch, the first time that comes into Europe is through the Cathedral of Amalfi. Here, Amalfi merchants trading with cities like Cairo saw the pointed arches of the Ibn Tulun Mosque and wanted to import it, and they imported the craftsmen, because again, local craftsmen in Amalfi didn't know how to make these things. And it was established that not only was the aesthetic effect more pleasing, but also the pointed arch is stronger. So that means you can build taller. And the abbot of the Benedictines paid a visit to Amalfi, saw the pointed arch, and decided he would like it in his monastery. And so that was in Monte Cassino, and then the abbot of Cluny, the absolute powerhouse, the headquarters of the Benedictines, also saw it and decided he would like it as well, and imported the same style, the same workman. And once Cluny had it, the fashion was set, if you like. So every bishop in every European city wanted to have pointed arches. And so this is when they had this enormous rash of cathedrals that were built all over Europe, using a lot of money that was gained from the Crusades. And the Benedictines made, they were of course sponsoring the pilgrimage route to Santiago de Compostela. And along the way stations, they built many buildings with using many styles like this ablak, the alternate patterns from Syria. And they used Kufic inscriptions without understanding at all what it meant, thinking it was just a holy writing of Christ. Again, a complete misunderstanding of what it actually meant. And at around this sort of time, for the first time in Christian iconography, we started getting things like this, which show God as architect of the universe, as a geometrician, if you like, holding his compass and measuring. So geometry enters the Christian sort of iconography. And again, this is knowledge, the whole geometry knowledge of vaulting and how to construct these incredibly complex buildings has been brought in. Military architecture is also indebted, and so again during the Crusades, Richard of Lionheart brought in military features that he had learned. He noticed the this scallop shape was much more effective at rebutting enemy cannonballs. And so he built here on the Seine, halfway between Rouen and Paris, Chateau Gaillard, which is still there today as a ruin. And he called it his fairy castle, his favorite castle. He lived there till he died, where he combined all the military knowledge that he had gained from his exposure in the Holy Land. And this map of Jerusalem, showing the Dome of the Rock as the center of Jerusalem, and pretty much all maps do still show it as the center. These are Christian maps, and yet the Muslim shrine has pride of place because, again, it was not understood this was a Muslim shrine. And so this was the first pictorial map of Jerusalem that was ever printed and circulated in many languages, the result of 1 century. And it remained current until the 18th century. And so this was the vision of Jerusalem that remained prevalent. Again, a completely unlikely centerpiece. And again, the Saracen style, Christopher Wren mentions the Basilica of St. Paul's as of St. Mark's in Venice as built in the quintessentially Saracen style, the vaulting of the domes. And of course, the Ottoman skyline, the Süleymaniye, uses the same dome technique, the vaulting technique of the double dome. And here we have two pictures. On the right is St. Paul's, the interior dome, and on the left is the interior of the Süleymaniye in Istanbul. And again, you can see how similar the design of the domes has been. And this is explored. There's a whole chapter in the book that compares Sinan and Wren in a way that I don't think has ever been done before. And again, this is just to show that even in the Süleymaniye today, you have stained glass windows. The tradition of stained glass windows is not unique to Christianity at all. So Venice, again, I mean, many people have said that Venice is essentially, instead of being called Venetian Gothic, it should be called Venetian Islamic. I mean, look at it all. I mean, you've got pointed arches everywhere. You've got this style, the telephone dial style, as it's called. It's directly copied off a Mamluk building in Cairo. You've got the Doge's Palace, which is quintessentially Islamic in the styles. Again, the Venetians adored the styles. They were openly, they adopted Arabic words into their dialect. They were openly great fans of Islamic architecture and were not at all shy of using it. And now in Spain, again, to come now into the sort of the revival period, if you like, on the left we have Burgos Cathedral, which is 14th century, and on the right we have the Sagrada Familia by Antoni Gaudi in Barcelona, which is still being built. Of course, it's due to be finished in 2026, and which is, I think, the centenary of Gaudi's death. And if you look at that, to my eye, it's almost as if that is the modern example of everything. Sort of, it should be called sort of, Saracenic, Hispano, Gothic, whatever. It just manages to amalgamate every single element that we've seen. And Gaudi himself wrote openly of his debt to Islamic architecture and the importance of a building being organic and growing from nature, this extraordinary combination of appearing to be effusive, and yet every little detail has been measured down to the last millimeter. And this is a close-up of the Sagrada Familia, which again reminds me of the close-up of Qasr Mushatta, that Umayyad facade, again bursting with life and energy, except that instead of animals intertwined, it's people intertwined in the foliage here. And then, of course, we have the Gothic revival, just to finish with now, that comes back in the 19th century big time, becomes incredibly popular. And, of course, Big Ben and the Houses of Parliament, covered in pointed arches, trefoil arches, the tower going up in registers, becoming ever more ornate as it gets to the top, and the dome in Regency Pavilion in Brighton, again, sort of mock Saracenic style with minarets, pretending, with chimneys disguised as minarets. Montmartre in Paris, which again on its own website openly talks about the Islamic influence in its double domes inside. This is now New York. I mean, we've crossed over the Atlantic, and Gothic, of course, comes to America. And what have you got here? In this New York cathedral, you've got every single Gothic element: the twin towers, the monumental entrance, the pointed arch, the trefoil arches, the little finials, all of these elements in America. Gothic architecture is absolutely major in American universities. This is Yale, which is an almost entirely Gothic campus. This is the Harkness Tower on the left, and on the right is the main lending library, which looks for all the world like the nave of a Gothic cathedral. And then to end on, we have the Washington Capitol building itself, which inside, as you can see, is using exactly the same Saracen vaulting technique, the double dome that Wren talks about in his memoirs, and on which the whole book is based. So we sort of come full circle back to the vaulting to show that even in the heart of America, we have Islamic vaulting in the dome. And so really what the book is all about, and Rowan Williams, the former Archbishop of Canterbury, I think summed it up incredibly well in the endorsement that he very kindly gave to the book, that it's really all about how cultures interact and interweave and challenge the sort of assumptions we might make about our history. Because everything builds upon everything else, and nobody owns architecture, nobody owns science. Everything is interdependent and interwoven, and nothing would exist without what came before. And that's really what the book is trying to show, that no one country can claim this is our national identity, this is our building. You have to look at the bigger picture to understand how that building came to be what it is now. So that's come full circle. Thank you. Sorry about the Thank
you so much, Diana. It was really interesting. The book equally covers so much, and for you to, just cover a lot of it just now like that. Well done to you. It's a lot there to take in. Many people are perhaps not even familiar with some of the terminology, pendant and so on, but it is something, your background is coming from travel writing and so on. So what interested you, firstly, to write the book like this? How did you, what was it, the lack of something that you felt was missing in the field, or was it something that you felt, it'd be good if somebody could draw so many fields together, because you're covering architecture, art history, geography, there's really such a what interest.
In a way, it needs a sort of generalist like me, who has lived and worked in the Middle East, all my life, basically, since I made the decision to study Arabic at university. From that point on, I was lucky enough in those days to be able to travel, to most Middle Eastern countries, and see firsthand all these buildings in a way that is genuinely difficult for people to do today. It's tragic that, of course, for the last 11 years, entering the 12th year now, Syria is a war zone, and visiting so many of these sites is impossible. So I feel very lucky that I did have the chance to do that, and I just sort of absorbed it all in a way, because my mother was German, and so as a child we travelled extensively in Europe, so I was very familiar with Gothic architecture, and then as I expanded my knowledge beyond Europe, and I began to see the interrelations, and to me it was perfectly clear. And as I said, I didn't understand that other people hadn't made those connections, if you like. So I felt in a way uniquely placed to make those connections. And I was very pleasantly surprised to find that there were so many scholarly works on which I could rely. So, for example, with the whole chapter on Venice, the work of the Deborah Howard, who's the architectural history professor at Cambridge, she devoted an entire decade of her life to studying the links, and so her book Venice and the East is the major source for my chapter on Venice. And again, with the Umayyad architecture, Robert Hamilton researched extensively, so all the information was there. But academics have a tendency to sort of research their little area in quite a sort of blinkered way and not see beyond it. And I mean, it's certainly quite an ambitious thing to attempt, but I felt it was worth it. It's been controversial, and of course, many people don't agree necessarily. But from the people who I've had conversations with about it, the people who do disagree are almost entirely older, shall we say, Eurocentric historians, who just cannot accept that these things came from beyond Europe. And yet, anybody who's actually studied it, it's pretty much incontrovertible that the pointed arch came from the Islamic world. I mean, it did not exist in Roman or Byzantine architecture. So, yeah, I mean, I have to say, I found the book in a way, because I had all this knowledge inside me, I didn't really understand how much I already knew until I started writing it, and it just sort of poured out of it almost and flowed. And of course, because I bought my house in Damascus back in 2005, which is an Ottoman house, and I'd gotten back into the academic world myself to do an MA in Islamic art and architecture, that, I suppose, deepened my interest in the whole subject and helped me to understand it more from within too.
Terminologies are very challenging in the field. That's something that the book picks up on, and I definitely know this. I did my thesis on looking at, this was my master's architecture. I looked at Spain, so 14th, 15th century Spain. And what happens there is you have the reconquest, so the expulsion of Muslims and Jews. But then the Christians kept building in what was the Muslim style.
Yeah.
So they kept the artisans and the craftsmen.
That's
and
right.
they had a word for them as well.
Yes, the Moderator.
Yes. Now, the problem that makes, or it highlights what the book is trying to say, is that they kept the artisans and they kind of confined the Islamic style to this kind of, they call it plateauresque or like decorative style, but they kept the building tradition firmly within the classical tradition. So the Gothic has like continued on, but the kind of what was known to be Islamic, it was a decorative art.
Yes.
Many of the early Islamic historians, they do refer to it as, Islamic art of being scared of leaving, empty spaces or evacuating.
Yes.
So terminology is really, I'm very glad that you picked up on this. And just to quickly highlight something very quickly, I don't want to bore you with my work, but I'm now researching on Mecca. So the Arabian Peninsula, that region was left out entirely because it didn't fit within the Western canon, within what was classical. Persia was great, the fertile presence of Arabia was boring, backward, and nomadic. So I'm finding in my research now, this term is very difficult to overcome so many decades of work.
Yes. There have been centuries of prejudice, basically, that you've got people like John Ruskin, the great heralded art critic of the 19th century, who writes his Stones of Venice book. He's very rude about Arabs in his thing, but loves Venetian architecture, and it's complete contradiction. But he doesn't see the contradiction because the colonial mindset of the sort of well-educated British person of that time is, you see it in terms of Eurocentric, style. And in fact, William Morris, you know, the arts and crafts movement, again, you know, the same thing. You know, he acknowledges the debt to Persia. Persia is regarded as civilized, you know, maybe because Indo-European Farsi is an Indo-European language, you know, like us, whereas anything, I mean, the word Islamic was not used at that time. It was Mohammedan or Saracenic. You know, but the whole thing of Arab, well, Arabs were not thought of as civilized. They, exactly as you're saying, they were Bedouin. They couldn't possibly have produced anything of any artistic merit.
Do you think Turkey, and now I'm not paid to say this, but do you think in Turkey there's more of a continuous tradition going on the Byzantine Empire that can perhaps kind of be an easier onion to peel away the layers, because it's a continuous tradition in Turkey. So you mentioned Sinan and so on. So,
yes.
So do you think that study of the Ottoman, post-Ottoman, that would be kind of something that kind of hits at the heart of the terminologies?
Yes, I mean, interestingly, William Morris does actually acknowledge Ottoman. He acknowledges the difference between Persian carpets and Turkish carpets, at least. I mean, thank goodness he's got something right in that. But yes, I mean, because I've actually just completed a book about the Ottoman cultural legacy. Again, you know, Ottomans built very much on the Seljuks, and the Seljuks were connected to the Persians, obviously, and you know, the Byzantine heritage of all of that is also clear. You know, it is the same blending of earlier cultures, but each one synthesizing it, taking the best, if you like, from it and synthesizing it into something new. But the thing about Turkey and Sinan and the Ottoman mindset, if you like, that I found so interesting, and this was completely new to me, I didn't know this before, I hadn't thought about it, was this very different way of thinking about space. The way I've come to think about this is the Christian way of thinking about space is hierarchy, basically. You look, you've got a long, thin nave. The important people are up at the front. There's got the altar. Only the important people are allowed by the altar and behind it. And then everybody is ranked down the long, thin nave, and the masses are at the back, you know. And it's a clear sense of hierarchy, and the clergy are in charge. In a mosque, everything is round. There is this absence of hierarchy because you don't need an intermediary between you and God. The relationship is directly between you and God. And that shows itself in the architecture. And that is something I find very, very interesting, that Sinan clearly understands that in a way that, that he tries to make the space sort of envelop you as you enter the building in a completely different way.
Also today, I would just say in Turkey, they retain all the craftsmen, marble craftsmen, stonemasons, and they can make the most fantastic arches and domes. And having worked there on that, it's amazing seeing that, and it's a continuous tradition.
Yes. It is, and I mean, obviously it was in Syria too, and so the Syrian architect who helped me with the restoration of my house in Damascus is now in Istanbul. You know, tragically, he's a Syrian refugee who left and has brought his skills as well.
Shall we open to the floor there? I'm sure there's lots of questions. Please go ahead.
There's one feature of Islamic architecture which seems not to have been borrowed, if I believe, is the muqarnas, which was a device developed to fit a circular dome onto a square base. And I wonder why that didn't go across.
Well, I have a theory. I mean, it's only a theory because nobody knows for sure, but I just think it was too technically difficult for them to make. But for the average European craftsman, if you like, to make, because they are phenomenally complicated to make, aren't they? I mean, unbelievably complex things.
The transfer of load on a Mukarna was traditionally phenomenal.
Yes.
And to redo something like that would have needed, it's not just the architect who designs it, it's done on site. So you need a master craftsman. Nowadays, the Mukarnas is just a pre-made shell. They just attach into
a mold
to cover it. But you're right, to have something like that would have really said a lot. But I would assume it would have been, that of a master craftsman on site.
Yes. Well, that's my theory anyway. It was just too difficult.
Any other questions?
I was wondering whether there was any. Is that not working? I was wondering whether there was a linguistic link. You mentioned the architectural heritage. I was wondering if there's like a linguistic, the language of the artisans or the architects from Syria and wherever they come from, whether any of the words are carried through into the names of things that we call them now. So, for example, even glass, we take glass for granted, but maybe glass is a word that they first called it. It is. Did you come across any? It's not something you looked at, but I just wondered if there was anything you can trace the roots of, like veins almost going back.
Yes, definitely. I mean, in Spain, particularly, Arab words, which clearly must have come from Syria, originally brought in by the Umayyads. There is actually a whole section about them in the book, in the chapter which is specifically about Spain. There's a whole list of them. I can't, off the top of my head, remember what they are now, but some of them are to do with vaulting. I have to dig them out. And, maybe afterwards I'll find them in the index. I can definitely find them. But yes, there are many ones which builders in Spain use to this day. That's what's so interesting, that they are still in use, these words. So they're not even just words that architects use, builders use them too.
I thought this might be a way to then confront people who were then denying the legacy.
Well, people who want to deny it seem to find ways of denying things, So they probably just say, oh, well, that's just a word, or they wouldn't acknowledge the depth of the resonance of what was behind that word.
Question over here at the front.
I think my voice is loud enough. So. A question. Why is it that a lot of the stuff that you write is generally not known? Is it because they're trying to construct people perhaps in the public eye as the enemy or the other? Is there an effort to construct them as that and to keep them in that position?
Well, there is an element of that, and I think it said in the blurb that the publishers wrote about the book, that obviously the whole Islamophobic thing does come in this. It feeds into it. And as it happens, the year that Notre Dame, that happened in April. As it happened, I went on holiday myself to Cordoba. I'd never been before. I went on holiday to Cordoba in May of that year and was shocked at what I found, at the complete absence of acknowledgement of what was clearly an Islamic building, and the fact that they were playing church music as you walk round, and all the crucifixes everywhere. I mean, it is a cathedral now, but even so, it's this definitely the Spanish, trying to sweep under the carpet, their Muslim past. I mean, it's undeniable, really, and a lot of Spanish people will admit that. And again, I just think that's wrong. It needs to be called out but it's definitely part of it. It was part of my motivation to write the book as well, because I personally think that because of a few crazy fanatics, extremists like ISIS. This has coloured people's views of Islam tragically. I mean, this tiny, tiny number of crazy people have given Islam and Muslims such a bad name. It's very, very unfair. You know, why should just this handful of people, you know, make all Muslims suffer? You know, it's just completely wrong. So,
Question at the back, please.
sorry.
Thank you so much, Anna. I was wondering if you could, I had two questions, but the first question is I was wondering if you could share with us your most kind of inspiring or awe-inspiring moments as you were doing your research, either when something that you found most surprising as you were doing your research. And the second question was if you could share a bit of like the kind of the reception of your work once it, you know, was produced, because it was a very recent.
Well, the thing that I think I got most excited about as I did the research, and that I certainly didn't expect. I mean, I mentioned the thing about the different sense of space. I found that very exciting because it was so enlightening, actually, how a building reflects something as deep as that in the architecture. But the other thing I learned in this, which is related in some ways, is this thing called fractal geometry. I don't know I'd never heard of it before, but it's basically, it's about the imperfections. And in a way, that's sort of a contradiction because geometry is incredibly precise. And yet, what Islamic architecture is striving to achieve is it recreates the imperfections of nature. So there's no right angle in nature. And every building, and again, interestingly, you see this in Gothic cathedrals, medieval Gothic cathedrals. They're all crooked, you know. There's no, I mean, which is why they got heavily criticised by, you know, the classicists, if you like. You know, the Renaissance people looked down on Gothic as, oh, you know, it's just full of so many faults, and it's got this wrong, and it's got that wrong, and this pillar's crooked. But that, and then what people discovered was that if they tried to repair or tinker with one bit of it, the whole thing went out of balance. And again, this just sort of shows, to my mind, this sense that the building, the craftsmen at that time, they didn't start with some huge plan. It evolved organically. Each workman did, you know, under the guidance of a master craftsman, started work, and the building sort of evolved, you know. And so, yes, certain bits were crooked in the same way that, you know, nature, you know, you look at a leaf or a crystal or something like that, and it's full of lots of tiny imperfections, but the end result is perfect in a way that's very, very difficult to recreate. And yet, that is what Islamic architecture is striving for, because, and this is the interesting bit, it's in those imperfections that you find God. That's what really struck me, that appreciation that it's in those little moments of imperfection, those glimpses, if you like. And that's what you get in the glass as well. The magical light, the way, you know, because the surface is not flat, it's all full of bumps and bubbles, and the organic nature of the materials means that when the light comes through it, you've got these sort of spiritual qualities that you simply would never match in a modern piece of glass. And that I found very exciting. Sorry, what was the second question?
Reception after.
Oh, yes. Well, I mean, I was delighted, of course, that the thing that the book got picked up really quickly, because The Guardian, the architecture correspondent of The Guardian, who I didn't know, a young Cambridge graduate in architecture, he happened to have been to Syria. So when the book talked about the dead cities, it meant something to him. He immediately acknowledged it as you know, a really important thing that had been forgotten. He said, yes, the dead cities, and in fact, the Syrian Tourist Board renamed them the Forgotten Cities. They really were forgotten. But he rang me and contacted me, did a very lengthy interview over the phone, over an hour, asking me all about it and the research and everything. And after that, he wrote an exceptional review in The Guardian a week before the book came out. And as a result of that, the impact that that review made, the book sold out on the first day. And from that point on, the publicity was astonishing, frankly. I mean, it was reviewed in pretty much every paper, except, interestingly, and again, I do find this interesting, except the Times and the Sunday Times, because there, you have a certain sort of traditional conservative viewpoint, which perhaps isn't so open to, a radical theory. It's Western radical theory. I mean, it's it's the revival of lost knowledge, if you like.
We are welcome to have you to Yunus Emre Institute, of course, as well.
Could I? Sorry.
Yeah, I want to make a point because we talk about Islamophobia. I find it deeply offensive your title, stealing from the Saracens. It's that's almost hostile to European people. We didn't steal them anyway. We might have adapted them from the Saracens. And bearing in mind, I have been to Syria, and a lot of the ancient architecture there is pre-Muslim. It's either pagan Roman, pagan local, or prehistoric.
Exactly.
Or
Yes.
Byzantine, which is not, it's pre-Islamic.
No.
So a lot of the art comes from that, and I think the Saracens took their art from them. So it's not a one-way street. And I think that's a little bit, you're almost compensating for Islamophobia, saying, yeah, so because some people deny everything Islamic, you try to make Islamic superior to everyone else. So I don't like that term stealing. It's not very
Well, that's why I explained it right at the beginning, and maybe you weren't here when I was explaining about the double irony of it, that it's a very deliberate choice because it's the derivation of the word. Saracens is from the Arabic salaka, to steal. So that's the point of it, and that's explained obviously in the introduction of the book, why the title is chosen. So it's a very deliberate choice, and it is obviously provocative in a way that's meant to be absurd. It is absurd. Of course, nobody stole from anybody. That's the point. And yet, isn't it crazy that we called these people thieves, thieves, Saracens, and yet we took things from them. That's what the title is. But many people, like yourself, have assumed it's a face value thing, and that I'm actually saying we Europeans stole from the Saracens. That's not at all what it's saying. So it's because, I mean, a lot of people have jumped to that conclusion without reading the book and without understanding the very careful choice of the title.
The reason I made the point is partly because a lot of architecture in Syria is not Muslim, not Saracen.
That's why the first chapter in the book is about the pre-Islamic heritage.
The second point is that a large number of very woke, politically correct people who like to denigrate our culture. There's a great movement of that today in our society, and the Western society now sort of deprivate our society, and I find that it's going too far the other way. So you've got the racists who don't like foreign people in their culture, and then you've got the sort of liberal, woke people who denigrate our society, and I don't like either attitude. Frankly, I think we should be more in the middle, somewhere, not polarized.
No, I agree.
And that title does shout woke.
I don't even know what woke means.
Well, it's basically, it gives me an idea that Europeans just stole things. They didn't have any original ideas for themselves. That's what it kind of implies to me, how I see it.
But you, probably like me, are the product of an education system. I mean, I certainly am, that taught me at school that Greece and Rome were the source of all civilization. That's what I was taught at school, and that's what I genuinely believed until I went beyond Greece. And, I mean, 19th century British colonial mentality was very much like that. That Greece and Rome, I mean, think of Kenneth Clark's civilization. I mean, it didn't mention anything beyond Greece. And yet, what we miss is that, how European were the Greeks, for heaven's sake, the Greeks. If you look at Greek culture, pretty much everything that the Greeks that we think of as Greek, you know, like the gable facade, like that, the temple shape, was in fact taken from the Iranians in central Anatolia, you know, two centuries earlier in the 7th. I mean, so again, to sort of say that the Greeks did this, you know, again, it's just not true. You know, you've only got to go to see the earlier examples of things like the gables carved into the cliff sides in central Anatolia of the Iranians to see that the Greeks took it from there. And most of the and many Greeks in you know, the Greek Empire, if you like, all over the Levant, all over what we call the Near East, you know, whatever you want to call it. The language there, I mean, we call it the Greek Empire, and yet Greek as a language was barely spoken except by the top elite. The ordinary people who lived there spoke Aramaic. It was the leaders who spoke Greek. So the Greek veneer, if you like, on the population there was very slight. And they took, you know, again, you can see it in the architecture. The Greeks took a lot of the early elements of the native architecture there and from further east as well, and brought it back. You know, I mean, it's just, you can't argue with the evidence of buildings.
Yeah, similarly, Diana, it's been something that many artists saw it, like name, you know, Jonathan Bloom, Monte Grabar, Renato Holly, my old professor. A lot of them touched on some of these ideas, but they never said it directly. They always mentioned that there's a big problem we have with Muhammad and Saracen, all this terminology, which I mentioned earlier, but it's just making it feel very confusing. And so as architects or architects, we have to work backwards and really get through all this confusing terminology. But really, it is a continuation of ideas. It's not that Islam is a dominant in the hierarchy or anybody.
No.
It's an evolution of ideas.
Exactly.
And I felt that that's what you were really saying.
Exactly. Yes.
Yes. No, in that sense, you know, I appreciate the point the gentleman making, but you know, for myself, I can say that this book is part of perhaps a new movement, if I can call it that, of that's the most radical work I've seen. Just, you know, as an artist, we like to self-promote, but we just did an exhibition at Istanbul Airport called Pioneers of Modern Science to kind of showcase how the history of science is actually made up of much more than what we think. So if anyone flies into Istanbul Airport, gate A3, you can see my work there. Any more questions?
Would you call Rowan Williams woke? You know, I mean, what he said about the book, he completely understood what the book was trying to say in that endorsement that I showed, which is on the back cover. You know, I mean, he just understood that it's all about multiculturalism, basically, acknowledging multiculturalism and its benefits. That's really what the book is about.
We'll move on to the next question, please. I think we have the gentleman at the back in the middle.
Thank you, Diana. To take us back to the history, I just wondered, you talked a bit about the modelling process with visitors from Europe, pilgrims or whatnot, coming to the Holy Land and mistaking the meanings of certain artifacts and appropriating it as Christian symbols or whatever in their travels back home. I wondered if there would be any kind of interaction with local Christians or co-religionists in the area, who probably would speak the language, so might have a better understanding of the meanings of artifacts and so on, who might maybe be able to interact with visiting pilgrims. Was there kind of an interaction there that shaped the understanding of foreign visitors?
Well, I mean, to be honest, I would have assumed that there was, but what I was surprised to learn from my researchers was how little there actually was. So, for example, one of the surprise discoveries, if you like, from that crusading period was the whole thing about heraldry. So, I mean, I did not know this before, but again, you know, a German scholar Maya, devoted 10 years of his life to, and he wrote a book called Saracenic Heraldry, and he studied every piece of heraldic emblem and tracked it all down. And basically, the Crusaders saw on the plains of Syria Saracen knights, to call them, by the way Crusaders saw them, Saracen knights holding jousting competitions, essentially. They would wear on their helmets and on their shields emblems of animals, and the Christians, the Crusaders saw this and liked the idea and took the heraldic symbols, the whole concept of it, brought it back to Europe and developed it into this whole hierarchical system of heraldry, which of course then becomes very dominant in stained glass windows as well, all over the place. And every family has to have their heraldic crest. It's turned into a hierarchy thing again, in a way that it simply wasn't. When Syrian knights were jousting, they just chose whatever animal they happened to like. There was no hierarchy element to it at all. It was just it wasn't developed in the way that Christians decided to develop it afterwards. So, but it doesn't really show much of an interaction. I mean, I couldn't find much evidence, to be honest, of people. There must have been some, but I didn't find them. I mean, that doesn't mean they didn't exist, obviously. But,
we would love to have more questions, perhaps over the book signing while going, but we are out of time. Thank you so much. Thank you so much to Diana for really coming and sharing with us some of your work. Love to read it in detail. It's very heavy. Thank you again. A round of applause and book signing.